All right, everybody, welcome to your online session. For tonight, we're going to be talking about the institutional macro environment. So if you can think about our analysis so far, we have basically broken down every layer possible, trying to understand how a firm is shaped with competition in the industry and in their strategic group. If you think we've started from kind of competitive forces, where we looked at the number of firms, we said that these dynamics are influenced by history. We said they're influenced by forces that are shaping the nature of competition. That was what we did in Porter's Five Forces. And now what we're going to do is start to look at, after a strategy is built, what my firms have to consider, given that they exist in a world of culture, they exist in society, they exist in a regulatory environment, and all of these things are going to impact the decisions they make and also potentially either create or destroy opportunity. So we call it the institutional environment. We also call it the macro environment. So if you can remember your early days in your macroeconomics class where you thought about GDP and you thought about inflation and consumer choice, and all of these influences are going to have some impact on how the firm operates and also how the strategic group operates. Now, with respect to institutions, what we mean is like the social customs, norms, things that you kind of just know. You don't really know why you know them, but you believe they're true. They're your values. They're the things you think are right and wrong. They're the things that you've been taught your whole life as to how to behave and why to make those decisions, right? If they're right or wrong, basically. So going with that, we're going to get started here. And the end goal of this presentation is for you to be able to take this massive body of information, right, society and the government, and basically say, how is this going to impact my firm? And hopefully get some type of decision-making tool out of this. So going forward, let's begin. A couple of images I want you to take a look at. I'm trying to get you to access your institutional environment, right? All the things that you think are right and wrong. So I've chose pictures that are obviously kind of loaded for you to have one feeling or another. So what do you think? I imagine you're thinking, well, it could be resources, could be energy, could be production, could be that you see money, it could be that you see devastation, it could be that you see bad behavior, it could be that you see something that we shouldn't be pursuing anymore. Or you might be seeing technology, right? So what I'm trying to get you to realize is that just from this simple image, it's obviously something that humans have created. There is a big wealth of institutional structures that are embedded in this picture, right? It took technology to figure out how to do this. It took humans to say whether it was the right decision or not. It took capitalism to take it to the level that you see in this picture, just absolute extraction to the nth degree. It took so many different aspects of human history to be able to create this picture. Okay, so going forward. How does this one make you feel? Right? So the same kind of image, right? What comes from that oil is eventually this gas station. But whereas that looked bleak and probably something that most people don't see, notice what BP has done here to kind of make this okay, right? So they know that they can't just have some raw industrialized looking gas station. That doesn't attract people. The fact that this gas station is well lit and the fact that it has safety features and it's kind of embedded in an economy, all these things are what BP is doing to help kind of transfer your institutional environment to their bottom line. So they know that they exist in a culture where there could be some moral dilemma of continuing to use petroleum. So they're going to have to do basically everything they possibly can to make sure that the consumer feels comfortable. So all these little details are taken into account. All right, so that one's kind of nice. Let's go to one that's a bit more loaded, as I said earlier. All right, well, yeah, it looks nice. Stream water, clear water, crystal, right? Trying to give you this idea that this is fresh and nice, and yet it's embedded in plastic containers. And we know that eventually it goes to this, just a big trash pool. We really have not figured out what to do yet with all of this plastic. So a technological solution here, right? We need ways to carry water, to get clean water to each other. It's actually becoming less and less a luxury and more a necessity, funny enough. But we still have not dealt with the aftermath of what to do with all this plastic. So again, an institutional structure, something that helps us on one side here's the technological devastation that has not yet been resolved. One of my old professors in grad school always said, a new invention always creates new problems, and that's kind of trying to get at really what this institutional environment is. Okay, I got one more for you. Oh, no, moving on. Okay, so we're starting to think about what these institutions are. And I think that once you start to access it, you become quite aware of how firms make decisions. It's not always a perfect picture, it's not always a perfect plan. And so I think good managers know that they have to be able to access this institutional environment and they have to be ready to act if the environment changes. So the kind of the cultural institutional environment is one that's going to take a very careful consideration by managers. They have some degree of influence there, but those bigger macro structures like the government or macroeconomic instability, those are going to be ones that firms will have to try their best to deal with, but truly it is an uncertain environment. So what do we mean by this institutional environment? We can be a bit more clear now. And I think I like to put it this way. Even when you think you have the perfect strategy, there are forces that exist outside of the industry, outside of the strategic group, that will fundamentally either make or break your decision. So what could this be? Cultural changes. Okay, so as an example, we've gone from thinking that we can eat steak every single day, we can have hamburgers every single day, we can have all this bad food for us every single day with no consequence. Well, obviously this isn't the case, right? We saw epidemics in heart disease and heart failure and obesity, right? So culture massively changed, and that's obviously going to be a kind of an obvious one for you to think about. Culture can also be tastes and trends. It can be perception of what's right and wrong. It could be employment. These are kind of things we've been talking about all semester, but we really needed to kind of boil it down, and that's what we're trying to do with this presentation. Laws can change. So 50 years ago, the landscape for businesses is much different. What was acceptable practice, how you got rid of your waste, what's legal in terms of discrimination practices. All these things are constantly changing, and this can either, again, make or break a firm, or it has to be dealt with in their strategy. Politics, obvious one, right? We are existing in a time where politics have become so divided that it is, in fact, becoming a risk for businesses. How do you deal with extremes on both sides? Middle ground is where certainty is found, and that simply is not the case. So sometimes laws are on your side with certain political regimes, and sometimes laws are not on your side with certain political regimes. So firms are always having to try to figure out, how am I going to manage a landscape that is outside of my individual operations? So I mentioned the macroeconomy. All right, so again, this is kind of like thinking pretty big here. We focus a lot on the microeconomy, that's individuals, that's firms, but there is this sum that is greater than the parts. And so this is what's kind of breeding recessions or economic booms. These are things that really are just kind of on their own path, unfortunately. Now, we do have some ability to control them. That's what the Federal Reserve is trying to do. That's what the federal government sometimes tries to do. Yes, that was my little joke. But really, there's kind of forces that macroeconomists are not actually 100% sure how they're operating, and firms are as well not sure how they're operating. So this is going to have to be something that managers are consistently trying to think about as they navigate through this truly uncertain world. Think about the impact of technology. We can go back to the 90s and the massive changes that occurred for businesses with the advent of computers and software. And it sounds kind of status quo today, and you can't even really think of a time when that didn't exist. But imagine changing all of your operations from paper to electronic records. I mean, this was a massive disruption, potentially positive, but also negative for some firms because it was a huge cost, but eventually it would lead to efficiencies. So all of these things are kind of what I mean by this institutional environment. We can think of technology as part of this because we can think of technology as the sum of human ingenuity and human behavior for, gosh, since basically the beginning of time. Technology is just the continuous improvement in some cases, or to continuous degradation in some cases, of how we deal with problems as human beings. resource-based changes. So for so long, we didn't think there would be any potential need to think about oil or to think about gas or to think about energy. We lived in a land of plenty for so long. Now, obviously, things are changing, and firms are starting to recognize that sooner or later, you can't really keep the status quo behavior. You have to change up your energy plan. It's become actually a real concern. Recently, I read an article in the Harvard Business Review where they started surveying firms, saying, what is your idea of how the environment is changing, and what are you guys doing about it? And basically, the conclusion is, well, it's starting to become a cost, and potentially going to become a long-term cost. So firms are actually having to start to adjust their strategy, particularly ones that are heavy energy users, to deal with the changing resource base that we might find. So if that's a depleting resource base, we might also find new sources of resources. There's kind of this idea that resources are not really something that's there, they become. So things that haven't been invented yet as a resource potentially will be, even though they're out there today. So again, these are all things that firms have to deal with. Think about this statement. A firm who wants to stay competitive must be ready to deal with this changing landscape. There could be opportunities, there could be threats. And that's really what we're trying to get at here in this analysis. It's massive, don't get me wrong, but you have to be able to kind of think massive sometimes and boil it down to something that's manageable. That's really what's going to separate one good firm to the next, is how they deal with all of the complexities of the economy, of culture, and of the changing culture and changing economy. So we're trying to consider this macro environment, right? Here's a bit more of a drilled down idea, kind of giving you broad, and we're trying to get more specific here so you can actually think about this. It's very difficult. So I'm saying it's the larger, more inclusive environment in which the firm is based, right? It's the social context of the firm. It's the rules of the game. Think about this. It is the social context for the firm as a meaningful group of activities. And once you start to realize the firm is not just something that's existed, it really has come to be. It is the creation of humans. The rules of what a firm is, the organizational structure of what a firm is, the fact that there's one chief executive officer in some cases, the fact that there's sometimes horizontal management structures where there's many managers working on individual pieces of the firm. These are all social contexts, and a firm will have to decide what is going to be the right structure for their individual purpose. We also have to think that this can be the influence of what things the firm should be done to do to be successful. Now, think about last class when we talked about corporate culture, right? Some firms go to great lengths to create a institutional environment within their firm that fosters what they believe is productivity and innovation. Some firms don't do that at all. They're simply using workers as just a piece of a machine, right? They go in there with very specific tasks, they do them, and they leave for the day. So firms have to figure out what is going to be the right institutional structure for their success. Going back to that same idea I said earlier in the class, there's basically a recipe that firms have. So trying to think about that in the context of this larger macro environment is going to define success or not. You have to define the rules of the game, instructions on how to play. You can think of institutions in the most basic sense as that which enables and constrains behavior. It allows us to do things. It says this is okay to do these things, and it says these are not okay to do these things, right? Firms can't steal. They can raise their prices, and effectively it feels like they're stealing from you, but these are things that you cannot do, and there are things that you can do. So again, think about institutions as rules, laws, customs, norms, morals, ethics, the most basic